They told me to leave it alone. Don't look at it. Don't touch it. Don't even think about it. Their voices carried an urgency I didn't fully understand then, the kind of warning that comes from experience or fear. I heard their words, saw the way their faces tightened when they spoke about it, but still, something in me wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was my pride, or my need to prove that the world isn't as strange and unexplainable as some people believe, or maybe it was something else entirely. The village wasn't supposed to exist. I couldn't find it on any map, and no one could tell me how to get there. It was always somewhere out there, past the forest, beyond the old road, hidden in the folds of the hills. I wasn't even sure I believed in it, not until I stumbled on it by accident, lost after my car broke down on a fog-drenched road late one night. I thought I'd found salvation, a quiet, peaceful place where I could rest, get my bearings. But from the moment I stepped into that village, I could feel it. Something wasn't right. You know that feeling when someone is watching you, but you can't see them? Or when the air feels colder in one spot, like it's pressing against your skin? That's what it was like, everywhere. The people were polite but distant. They didn't ask why I was there, didn't invite me in, didn't even seem surprised to see me. It was as if they already knew I was coming, as if they'd been expecting me. Their eyes lingered just a little too long, their smiles too tight. And then there were the whispers. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but they were there, always there, in the streets, behind the walls, even when I was alone. It was one of the villagers who told me about the book, an old man sitting on a wooden bench, his hands trembling as he smoked a pipe. He didn't look at me when he spoke, just stared straight ahead as if he were talking to someone or something I couldn't see. "You're not from here," he said. "If you find the book, leave it where it lies. No good comes from that thing." I laughed it off at the time. A cursed book? It sounded ridiculous. But he wasn't laughing. His eyes, I still see them in my dreams, empty, hollow, like someone who's seen too much. I didn't take his advice. I should have, but I didn't. The cottage was the last building at the edge of the village, barely standing under the weight of its own decay. No one lived there. No one ever went near it. I should have known better, should have listened to the way the air changed as I approached it, thicker, colder, as if the house itself was warning me to stay away. But I didn't. The door opened too easily, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something faint but sharp like iron. And then I saw it, sitting on a small, broken table in the center of the room, bathed in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The book. It looked ancient, its leather cover cracked and flaking, the edges blackened as if it had been burned but refused to be destroyed. There were no words on the cover, just strange symbols etched deep into the leather, symbols that seemed to move if you looked at them too long. My hands shook as I reached for it. I didn't want to touch it, but I did. The moment I opened it, the room grew colder. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, bending toward me, as if they were watching. The first page was blank, so was the second. But on the third, there were words. No, not just words, rules. Written in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood them. Do not leave the book unattended. Do not speak to the voices. Do not respond if it calls your name. And at the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed to bleed into the paper itself, once opened, you cannot escape. I laughed, nervous maybe, or just trying to convince myself that it was all some elaborate prank. But then I heard it, a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, calling my name, from behind me. I turned, of course I turned, and that was my first mistake. That was the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped being sure of what was real, what was safe, or if I'd ever leave that village alive. And now I'm going to tell you everything, because someone has to know. Someone has to understand what's out there, waiting, watching. But I'll warn you now, once you hear this, you won't forget it. Once you know, it'll follow you too. I suppose I should start with why I was there in the first place. People often ask, why would you go to a place like that? The answer isn't simple. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to get away from everything that made sense, everything that felt predictable. I had been a collector of sorts, not of things, but of stories. Those whispered legends and half-forgotten tales you hear in the corners of old pubs or tucked into dusty books no one's read in decades. Folklore fascinated me. It always had. Something about the way people passed down their fears, their superstitions, as if they were guarding something important, something real. But this time, it wasn't just the stories that drew me. I needed to get away. My life back home, well, let's just say it wasn't much of a life anymore. A bad breakup, a job that drained the life out of me, and a feeling I couldn't shake, that I was wasting time, my time. So when I overheard someone mention the village, a place no one could find, no one dared visit, I didn't hesitate. I packed a bag and left. No real plan, no clear destination, just a vague idea of where I might find it. When I finally found the village, it was like stepping into another world. It wasn't on any map, of course, and the road that led there felt more like an accident than a path. Trees arched over it, their branches intertwining like they were trying to hide something. The fog grew thicker as I drove, swallowing the light, muffling the sound of the engine, until I thought I might be the only person left in the world. And then, suddenly, there it was. A cluster of stone cottages, their roofs sagging under the weight of moss and time. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, curling into the gray sky, but the village itself was eerily quiet. No cars, no children playing, no sound except for the wind rattling the bare branches of the trees. The people, they were different. Not unfriendly, exactly, but distant. They watched me as I walked through the narrow streets, their eyes cautious, their faces unreadable. No one approached me, no one asked who I was or why I was there, but I could feel their gaze on me, feel the weight of their silence pressing down on me. It wasn't the warm curiosity of a small town greeting a stranger. It was something else, something colder. I found a small inn, if you could call it that, run by an old woman whose name I never learned. She gave me a room without asking questions, just handed me a key and told me, "Keep your windows closed at night." When I asked why, she didn't answer, just looked at me like she was waiting for me to understand something she wasn't going to explain. The first few days were uneventful. I walked through the village, taking notes, trying to piece together its history. The houses were old, older than anything I'd seen before, their stones blackened with age and weather. There was no church, no school, no signs of modern life. It was as if the village had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. But the strangest thing was the lack of names. The villagers never introduced themselves, and when I asked about the place, they would only call it here, as if giving it a name would make it real in some way they didn't want. It wasn't until I met the old man that things began to shift. He was sitting on a bench near the edge of the village, staring out at the hills. His clothes were threadbare, his hands gnarled with age, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something that made me stop. I asked him if he'd lived there long. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me at first. But then, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, he said, "You shouldn't have come here." I laughed, thinking he was just another wary villager. "Why not?" I asked. He turned to me then, his gaze steady, unblinking. "Some things in this place are best left buried," he said. "You think you're just passing through, but this place, it doesn't let go." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he stood up and walked away, leaving me there with his words echoing in my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and for the first time, I noticed how dark it was. Not just the absence of light, but a kind of darkness that felt alive, pressing against the windows, seeping into the room. I thought about what the old man had said, about the way he'd looked at me. And then, for reasons I still can't explain, I got up and left the inn, wandering toward the edge of the village, toward the cottage no one talked about. And that's when I found it. The book. sitting there, waiting for me, as if it had been waiting all along. It started with a restless feeling, a pull I couldn't resist. That night, as the wind screamed through the narrow streets of the village, something drew me to the outskirts, past the rows of crumbling stone cottages and out toward the forest. I hadn't planned to go far, just enough to clear my mind, to shake the weight of the old man's warning. But the further I walked, the heavier the air became. It was colder there, damp with the scent of moss and decay. The ground beneath my boots grew softer, the crunch of gravel replaced by the squelch of mud. And then, out of the mist, I saw it. The cottage. I don't know how I missed it before. It sat alone at the edge of the woods, its roof sagging under the weight of time, ivy twisting its way up the stone walls like veins. The windows were shattered, gaping holes that stared out at nothing. The door hung crooked on its hinges, swinging slightly in the wind as if inviting me inside. Every instinct told me to turn back, to walk away and forget I'd ever seen it. But I didn't. The first step inside was like crossing a threshold into another world. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the scent of decaying wood hit me like a wave. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each creak echoing in the silence. Dust hung in the air, catching the faint light that slipped through the broken windows. And then there were the sounds, soft, barely there, but unmistakable. A faint whisper like the rustle of fabric or the breath of someone standing just out of sight. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I don't know how long I wandered through that place. The rooms were small, empty, except for broken furniture and piles of debris. But in the corner of the last room, beneath a rotting chest that had all but collapsed under its own weight, I found it. The book. At first I thought it was just another piece of junk, forgotten and left to rot. But as I pulled it free, I felt it. A sudden chill, like ice crawling up my spine. The leather was cracked and blackened with age, the edges stiff and jagged, as if it had been burned but refused to be destroyed. And the symbols on the cover, I can't explain them. They weren't letters, weren't anything I'd ever seen before. They seemed to shift when I looked at them, writhing like they were alive. I should have left it there. I should have walked away, but I didn't. My hands were shaking as I opened it, the cover stiff and reluctant, like it didn't want to be touched. The pages were thick, yellowed with age, and smelled of something sharp and metallic. The first few were blank, but as I turned them, words began to appear. Not written in ink, but etched into the page, the grooves so deep I could feel them under my fingertips. The first thing I saw was a list of rules, written in a language I shouldn't have been able to read but somehow understood perfectly. They weren't instructions. They were warnings. Do not speak to the shadows. Always leave an offering at midnight. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. My heart was pounding as I read them, each line more absurd, more impossible than the last. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a threat. And then at the bottom of the page, in jagged, hurried letters that looked like they'd been carved into the paper with a blade, I saw the final warning. Once opened, you cannot undo what you've awakened. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt darker, smaller, as if the walls were closing in. And then I heard it. My name, soft, distant, but unmistakable, carried on the wind like a secret meant only for me. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. The sound was coming from the doorway behind me, but I couldn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. Instead, I slammed the book shut and clutched it to my chest, as if that would somehow protect me. The whispers stopped, but the feeling didn't. That cold, crawling sensation, like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to make a mistake. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in my room at the inn, the book still clutched in my hands. It should have felt like a victory, like I'd found something extraordinary, but all I felt was dread. Because deep down, I knew. The book wasn't just a relic, wasn't just a piece of forgotten history. It was alive, and now it was mine. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dim light of a single candle, the book resting on the table across the room. I wanted to believe it was just an old artifact, something strange and unsettling, but harmless. But every time I looked at it, I felt its weight, as if it was more than just leather and paper. It felt like a presence, watching me, waiting. The rules I'd read kept looping in my mind. Do not speak to the shadows. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. I told myself they were nonsense. I told myself none of it mattered. And then I heard it again. My name, soft, distant, like a breath carried on the wind. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it came again, clearer this time, from somewhere just outside the window. My name whispered with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I stared at the shuttered window. It wasn't possible. No one knew my name here. I don't know why I did it. Reflex, maybe, or panic, but I answered, "Who's there?" The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted it. The air in the room changed instantly, growing colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The whisper didn't come again. Instead, there was silence, complete, suffocating silence. Even the wind had stopped. That was the first rule I broke. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me, but the feeling stayed. That oppressive, suffocating weight, like something unseen had slipped into the room and was now watching me from the shadows. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. Movement. Small, imperceptible shifts in the darkness. I told myself it was the flicker of the candlelight, but deep down I knew better. The next day things got worse. The villagers, who had already been distant, now wouldn't even look at me. When I passed them in the streets, they turned away, muttering under their breath. One of them, a woman with deep lines etched into her face, stopped in front of me. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me with eyes that looked almost sorry. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't catch it, she said, "It's already too late for you." Before I could ask her what she meant, she hurried away, disappearing into one of the cottages and slamming the door behind her. The symbols came next. At first, I thought they were just my imagination, lingering shapes from the book burned into my mind. But they were real. I saw them carved into the bark of trees at the edge of the village, etched into the stone walls of buildings, even scratched into the dirt paths where no one should have been able to draw them. They were the same symbols from the book, shifting and twisting if I looked at them too long, and they were everywhere. The nights were the worst. The footsteps started on the second night, faint at first, like someone pacing just outside my door. I told myself it was one of the villagers, maybe the old woman who ran the inn. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just an empty hallway and the faint echo of the steps retreating into the darkness. The cold grew worse, seeping into the room, no matter how tightly I shut the windows or stoked the fire. It wasn't just cold. It was something deeper, a chill that seemed to settle into my bones, numbing me from the inside out. By the third night, I started to hear whispers. Not just my name this time, but fragments of sentences, words that didn't make sense. Sometimes they came from the walls, soft and muffled like they were being spoken from the other side. Other times they were closer, so close I could feel the breath on my ear. "You shouldn't have answered," they said. "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to leave the village. I packed my things, threw the book into my bag, and headed for the road that had brought me there. But the road was gone. I don't know how else to describe it. The path that had been so clear before now twisted and turned, leading me in circles until I found myself right back where I started. The villagers watched me from their windows, their faces pale and drawn. No one offered to help. No one even came outside. And then I realized something else. The village itself was changing. The houses, the streets, even the trees. Everything seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. One moment, a tree would be bare and lifeless. The next, it would be covered in the same symbols from the book, carved deep into its bark. I started to feel like I wasn't in a village at all, but some kind of trap, a place that wasn't entirely real, or at least not in the way I understood reality. I couldn't tell if it was the book that was changing the village, or if the village had always been like this, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb it. Either way, it didn't matter. The lines between the two were blurring, and I was caught in the middle. And the worst part, I could feel it watching me. Not just the book, but something else. Something bigger. Something I couldn't see but knew was there, waiting for me to break another rule. The first slip wasn't entirely my fault. At least, that's what I told myself. After all, I hadn't meant to break the rule. It just happened. It was the second night, and I had barely slept. The whispers had started again, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer than they should, curling into shapes that made no sense. I sat in the corner of the room with my back to the wall, clutching a lantern as if the dim light could keep me safe. That's when I noticed the old clock. It was mounted on the far wall, a heavy, ornate thing that didn't match the rest of the room. The wood was dark and polished, its face cracked but still readable. I hadn't noticed it before, but now its steady ticking filled the silence. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the book sitting closed on the table. But the clock seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammering reminder of the time slipping away. I remember staring at it, watching the hands as they crawled closer to midnight. And then it happened. The second hand froze, just stopped mid-tick, as if the clock had decided it was done keeping time. For a moment, everything was still, and then without warning, it chimed. Once, twice, 12 times. But the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the clear, resonant tone you'd expect. It was warped, distorted, like a scream muffled by water. My heart was racing as I watched the hands start to move again, backward, slowly at first, then faster, spinning wildly until they were nothing but a blur. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to that broken chime echoing in the room. But when it finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It was thick, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then I realized, somehow, without meaning to, I'd broken the rule. The clock wasn't supposed to be touched. I hadn't physically touched it, but I'd looked at it for too long, let it pull me in, and now it was warning me. The next day, I ventured out into the village, desperate for answers. The villagers were more withdrawn than ever, their faces pale, their movements hurried. They wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak to me, except for a single child. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, her hair tangled, her dress hanging loose on her thin frame. She was standing at the edge of the road, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "You read the book," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about the book. "You broke the rules," she continued, her head tilting slightly to the side. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to a child, she recited the rules, word for word. "Do not speak to the shadows. Always leave an offering at midnight. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond." Her lips didn't move as she spoke, and her eyes never left mine. And then just like that, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next the space she'd occupied was empty. No footsteps, no sound, just gone. I ran back to the inn, my heart hammering in my chest. The villagers were watching me now, their faces blank, but their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or fear. I locked myself in my room and sat there, staring at the book. I wanted to throw it out, burn it, destroy it somehow. But every time I thought about it, the words came back to me. Once opened, you cannot undo what you've awakened. The third night was the worst. I didn't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, I knew something was wrong. My arm was burning, an intense, searing pain that made me cry out. I pulled back my sleeve, and that's when I saw it. A page from the book, etched into my skin. The words were there, perfectly legible, carved in black ink that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. They weren't in any language I knew, but somehow I understood them. I ran to the mirror, my breath coming in short gasps. The symbols weren't just on my arm, they were spreading, tiny, intricate lines branching out from the main text, curling around my wrist and up toward my shoulder. It didn't look like a tattoo. It looked alive, the ink writhing beneath my skin as if trying to escape. I scrubbed at it, clawed at it, but it didn't budge. And then from the corner of the room, I heard it. The voice again. My name, whispered in that same familiar tone. But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But there was nothing there, just the book sitting on the table where I'd left it. But the cover was open now, the pages fluttering as if moved by an unseen hand. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Read. I shook my head, backing away, but my legs gave out and I collapsed to the floor, the weight of the voice pressing down on me, forcing me to listen. I don't know how long I sat there, the symbols on my skin burning, the whispers growing louder, more chaotic. But when it finally stopped, the room was empty. The book was closed again, the air still and heavy, and I knew this wasn't just a curse. It was something worse, something that was only just beginning. By the fourth night, I had stopped pretending I could control any of this. The book had a will of its own, and I was no longer just an observer. I was its target. It started with a sound, faint at first but persistent, like a quill scratching against parchment. I had left the book on the table, closed and untouched. Or at least, I thought I had. When I turned to look, the cover was ajar, the pages trembling as if moved by an invisible hand. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it, new words forming on the blank pages, the ink dark and wet, glistening as it dried. The rules were changing. At first, they seemed the same, but as I read, I realized these weren't warnings meant for just anyone. These were meant for me. My name appeared at the top of the page, written in that same jagged, unnatural script. Rule 1, you will not leave the room tonight. My heart pounded as I continued. Rule 2, do not extinguish the candle. The final rule made my blood run cold. Rule 3, when the door opens, do not look. I slammed the book shut and stumbled back, my chest heaving. The air around me felt thicker now, almost unbreathable, as if the room itself was reacting to the book. The candle on the table flickered wildly, its flame stretching unnaturally high before shrinking down to a faint glow. And then I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A screech, high-pitched and unrelenting, like metal being dragged across stone. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room until I thought my skull would split open. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. And then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had started, the screeching ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. That's when I saw it, the shadow. It wasn't like the others I'd noticed before, the ones that danced at the edges of my vision. This one was different. It was solid, deliberate, standing at the far end of the room, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. It had no face, no features, just a black, shapeless void where a person's head should be. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and invasive, as if it were peeling back the layers of my mind. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadow stepped closer. The sound of its movement wasn't like footsteps. It was a dragging, scraping noise, like something being pulled across rough ground. The candle's light dimmed with each step it took, the room growing darker and colder until I was shivering uncontrollably. When it finally stopped, it was mere inches away from me. I could feel the cold radiating off it, a freezing, soul-deep chill that made my skin crawl. The screeching started again, this time quieter but more piercing, like it was coming from inside my own head. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. You are mine. The words weren't in English, but I understood them. They were a declaration, a claim, as if the shadow had marked me as its own. I don't remember how I found the strength to move, but I did. I grabbed the book from the table and hurled it across the room, hoping, praying that it would shatter, that its power would break. But it didn't. Instead, it landed open, the pages flipping wildly as if caught in a storm. New words appeared, glowing a deep, ominous red. You cannot destroy me. They read, the rules are eternal. Desperation took over. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal candlestick, and brought it down on the book with all my strength. The impact sent a shock wave through the room, the candle's flame extinguishing in an instant. For a moment I thought I'd succeeded. The book was silent, its pages still. But then, slowly, it began to regenerate. The torn pages reassembled themselves, the ink reforming into the same glowing script. The words were different now. They weren't rules. They were instructions. "Open the door," they commanded. My stomach turned as the door to the room creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but a yawning darkness beyond. The voice in my head returned, louder this time, urging me forward. "Come," it said, "the village must survive." That's when it hit me, the horrifying truth. The book wasn't just cursed, it was a trap. A living, breathing entity designed to lure in the curious and the desperate. It fed on us, used us to sustain the curse that kept the village bound in its web, and now it wanted me to play my part. I tried to resist, tried to fight the pull of the shadow and the book, but the rules had already taken hold. My body moved on its own, my feet dragging me toward the open door. The shadow followed, its presence growing stronger with each step I took. The villagers' faces flashed in my mind, their hollow eyes and cryptic warnings making sense now. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves, because once the book had someone new, it would leave them alone, at least for a while. As I crossed the threshold into the darkness, the last thing I heard was the sound of the book snapping shut behind me, and then nothing, just endless, suffocating black, the weight of the shadow pressing down on me until I thought I would be crushed. But I wasn't, not yet, because the book wasn't finished with me. I don't know how long I spent in that darkness. Minutes, hours, days, it all blended together, an endless stretch of nothingness. I could feel the weight of the shadow pressing down on me like a suffocating fog, its presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. I was standing in the middle of the village, the air thick with mist and the faint smell of wood smoke. It was silent, unnaturally so, as if the world itself had paused. For a moment I thought I was free, that I'd escaped. But then I noticed the book. It was in my hands, its cover warm, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. I turned slowly, the realization dawning on me. The village wasn't just a setting, it was part of the trap. Every path I took led me back to the same place. The cobblestone streets twisted in ways that defied logic, looping endlessly until I was certain I'd lost my mind. The shadows of the cottages seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their outlines jagged and wrong, like teeth in a broken jaw. No matter where I went, I always ended up back at the center of the village, the book growing heavier with each step. That's when I saw them, the villagers. They stood in a loose circle, their faces blank, their eyes dull and lifeless. They didn't speak at first, just stared at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. Finally, one of them stepped forward, an older man with deep lines etched into his weathered face. He looked at the book in my hands, then back at me. "You should have listened," he said, his voice low and trembling. "We all should have." "What do you mean?" I demanded, the words coming out harsher than I intended. He gestured to the others, their expressions shifting to something I couldn't quite read. "We were like you once," he said, "travelers, wanderers. We came here looking for something, answers, escape, purpose, and we found this." He pointed to the book, his hand shaking. "It binds us, keeps us here, and now it's your turn." I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest as if it were a lifeline. "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be a way out." The man's eyes darkened, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "There is," he said, "but it's not what you think." The villagers began to murmur, their voices rising in a dissonant chorus that sent chills down my spine. The old man stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "The book has one final rule," he said. "Follow it, and you might escape. Defy it, and, well, no one's ever tried." The final rule. I flipped the book open, the pages turning on their own until they settled on the last one. The words were clear, written in that same jagged script. To be free, you must take the place of the one who bound you. My stomach turned as the meaning sank in. I had to find someone else, another traveler, and pass the curse on to them. It was the only way to escape. The villagers were watching me now, their eyes filled with something I could only describe as expectation. They had all made this choice once, hadn't they? That's why they were here, because they'd done what the book demanded. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't condemn someone else to this nightmare. There had to be another way. That's when I remembered the fire. In the center of the village square, an ancient fire pit sat cold and unused. I didn't know if it would work, but it was the only option I had left. I tore through the streets, the villagers' cries echoing behind me. "Don't!" they shouted. "You'll doom us all!" But I didn't stop. I reached the pit and threw the book in, its pages catching instantly, the flames roaring to life as if they had been waiting for this moment. For a brief, glorious second, I thought I'd won. The book writhed in the fire, its cover curling and blackening, the symbols on its pages glowing one last time before fading into ash. But then the ground beneath me began to shake. The fire roared higher, its flames twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend, faces, hands, eyes, all screaming silently. The villagers fell to their knees, their cries blending into the cacophony of the fire, and then everything went still. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the fire pit, the villagers, something. But instead, I was back in the abandoned cottage where it had all begun. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of decay filling my nostrils. And in my hands, the book. It was whole again, its cover pristine, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. My heart sank as the realization hit me. I hadn't escaped. I'd only started the cycle over. I stood there, staring at the book, the weight of it crushing me. This was the trap. This was the curse. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I fought, I would always end up back here, holding this damn thing. And the worst part? I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else came along. Someone like me, curious and desperate, searching for something they didn't even understand. And when they did, I would have to make the choice, to follow the final rule, or defy it, again and again, until there was nothing left of me. The whispers started up again, soft and insistent, pulling me back to the book. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what it was showing me, but I couldn't stop myself. The pages flipped open, the ink shifting and reforming until the rules were clear once more. And at the bottom of the page a new line appeared, written in that same jagged hand, "Welcome back." I don't know how much time has passed, days, weeks, months. It's all a blur now. The book is with me, and it never lets me forget. It doesn't whisper anymore, doesn't need to. Its presence is constant, its weight a reminder of the choice I didn't make. The villagers have disappeared, or maybe I've disappeared from them. I'm not sure which. The only thing I know is that the village feels different now, emptier, quieter, waiting. Every morning I wake up to the book on the table, its cover pristine, its pages untouched. It doesn't glow anymore, but I know it's alive. I've tried to leave, of course. I've walked every path, taken every road, but they all lead back here, to this same cottage, to this same cursed book. The walls creak with its energy, the floorboards hum beneath my feet. It's like the house is alive, too, tethered to the book in ways I'll never understand. Sometimes I hear footsteps outside, faint and deliberate. They circle the cottage, pausing just long enough to make me wonder who or what is out there. But when I look, there's never anything there. The villagers used to warn me about the shadows, but now I think I've become one of them. Bound to this place, part of its endless cycle, its eternal trap. And yet, there's something else, a presence. Faint at first, but growing stronger every day. I've come to recognize it as the same pull that brought me here. It's searching, reaching out, looking for someone new. I can feel it in the air, a tension that builds and builds, pressing against my chest until I can hardly breathe. I don't know who it will find or when, but I know it's only a matter of time. I've thought about what I would say if someone else were to find their way here. Would I warn them, beg them to turn back, or would I do what the book wants, what the rules demand? Would I pass it on, let them take my place so I can finally be free? It's a question that haunts me every moment, and I hate that I don't know the answer. Because deep down, I'm not sure I'd resist, not after everything it's taken from me. And now, it's happening. I heard them today, footsteps on the cobblestones, the crunch of gravel beneath boots, a new traveler. They've entered the village, their voice carrying through the mist as they call out, searching for someone, anyone. I watched from the shadows as they approached the cottage, their curiosity drawing them closer with every step. They looked so much like I did when I first arrived, wide-eyed, eager, unaware of what's waiting for them. The book was already there, resting on the table, its cover catching the faint light streaming through the window, waiting for them. I wanted to stop them, to shout a warning, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I watched as they stepped inside, their movements hesitant but compelled. They paused when they saw it, their hand hovering over the cover, their face a mixture of fear and fascination. And then they touched it. The book responded immediately, the air around them shifting, the shadows growing darker, heavier. I could feel it, the moment the cycle began again. They don't know what they've done, not yet, but they will. The book will show them, just like it showed me, and I'll be here, watching, waiting, because this is my curse now, to witness, to remember, to carry the weight of every choice I didn't make. The book doesn't just trap us, it binds us to the village, to its rules, to its hunger. I know that now. The book is with me, and it's with them too. It's always with us, and it's always waiting. You've heard the story. You felt the pull of the book, the weight of the village, the suffocating terror that comes with breaking its rules. But let me ask you something. What would you have done? Could you have resisted? Could you have followed those strange, terrifying rules, knowing what might happen if you didn't? Or would your curiosity, your desire to understand, take over, just like mine did? Would you too have opened that book? Would you have read its rules, not knowing the consequences? Or would you have left it alone, no matter how tempting it was, just as the villagers begged me to? I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, could you have walked away? Could you have resisted the lure of the unknown, knowing that whatever lies within that book could change everything? What would you have done in my place? Or if you've ever come across something you couldn't explain, something that made your skin crawl, something that made you question everything you thought you knew about reality, share it with me. I want to hear your story. I might just feature it in the next video, but only if you're brave enough to share what happened to you. Only if you're willing to confront the fear I know you felt deep down. If you enjoyed this story, or if it scared you, if it left you wondering if you should even look at the next video, make sure you like, subscribe, and share it with someone else. Someone who might need to hear this story, or someone who might want to know if they could do better than I did. Because trust me, you don't want to be the next one to find that book. But in case you are, well, maybe we can help each other. Maybe we can finally break the cycle. The book's waiting, and so is the village. Until next time.